Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's daily devotional. So, our daily devotional today is going to come from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting in verse 6. Paul is dealing with these super apostles, so-called these super apostles. It's a strange term that Paul uses only this once here in chapter 11 in 2 Corinthians, and primarily here in chapter 11, chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians. And these individuals were insinuating themselves into with the brethren at Corinth, and were making themselves out to be apostles. And apparently, they were boasting and talking about all the things that they were able to do, and how that the brethren should listen to them, and so forth. But here, starting in verse 6, Paul starts talking about infirmities. And apparently, it would seem as though these super apostles were also trying to disparage Paul and try to prevent the brethren in Corinth from listening to Paul. And they may have been describing, certainly, it would seem that they described Paul's physical stature, almost like in a sense of making fun of him, suggesting that why are you listening to this guy? And starting in verse 6, starting in chapter 12, he talks about boasting. And here in verse 6, he says, "For though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will speak the truth. But I refrain lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me." Paul isn't trying to exalt himself, unlike these super apostles. "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure." Again, what this thorn in the flesh was, he calls it a messenger of Satan. Whether this was the issue with his eyes, we know that he had some issue with his eyes, as he writes to the Galatians in chapter 4. I tend to think that maybe this was a separate issue, but it could very well have been the same. In verse 8, he says, "Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me." This is kind of a additional note as well to our look at Christian Science and Mary Baker Eddy, and how that she was convinced that if you have true belief and full understanding, spiritual understanding, that you could be healed of any sorrow or anything that you have. Well, obviously, the Apostle Paul even apparently didn't have that spiritual understanding. It just goes to show that Mary Baker Eddy did not either deliberately or she was convinced of something that doesn't actually exist. There is suffering in this world for a reason. In fact, that's part of what Paul's talking about. He says, "Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." See, Paul understood what the words of Jesus, or the Lord, is what he says. He said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." These super apostles were promoting themselves as strong people, it would seem, strong human beings perhaps, without weakness, as if they were perfect people, in the sense of not just without sin, but perfect people, not having any problems, any sorrow, any distresses, any issues going on in their life. Paul says that he had this thorn in the flesh. He prayed 3 times that God would take it away. Paul couldn't just lay hands on himself to be healed. He prayed to God that God would take it away, whatever this thorn in the flesh was. And the Lord's response was, "My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness." In other words, no. And there is a reason why I'm saying no. And when he says, "My strength is made perfect in weakness," Paul understood what that meant. He says, "For when I am weak, then I am strong." And the whole point of our daily devotional today is to remind ourselves that nobody likes to suffer. Nobody likes to go through trials or persecutions or having difficulty in life, in whether it's physical, financial, spiritual, mental, whatever the case may be. Nobody enjoys going through hardship. But Paul says that I take pleasure in infirmities. Why, Paul? Because it reminds him that in those difficult times, so no matter what the source of the problem is, that's when I have to rely on God. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And that is what Jesus says, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. When we realize that we are weak, and it doesn't matter what our physical state is in terms of whether we're dealing with health issues or not, whether we're financially secure or not, in the end, as human beings in general, with no control over this world, no control over what happens, what doesn't happen, all we control is ourselves. In the end, we are weak. Okay, that's simply the fact of the matter. Human beings are weak, and we cannot get to heaven by ourselves. We cannot fight against Satan by ourselves. And so Paul gained from this perspective to remember that in times of distress, certainly, but in all times, that we have to rely on Jesus. We have to lean on him and on his strength. And when we go through difficult times, when we have hardship, when we're enduring pain, or whatever the case may be, those are added reminders that when I am weak, then I am strong, because that's what reminds me to rely on God, to rely on Jesus, to rely on his word, to comfort me, to guide me, to keep me on the straight and narrow, and to remind me of the perspective of this life, that this life, again, we have no control. And in these moments, Paul didn't have control over this thorn in the flesh. And yet, what he was reminded in this moment was that that's okay, that I have to rely on the Lord, I have to trust that he is in control, and I have to trust in his will and rely on the comfort that he gives me through his word. And I think that that's just it's a great reminder from Paul to the Corinthians as well as to us, that being weak in the flesh, being in terms of having disease or having physical issues that we're dealing with, having hardships, having trials that we face, those aren't, while they aren't enjoyable. Okay, that certainly is the case. At the same time, Paul, in the midst of those trials, found joy. He says, I will take pleasure in infirmities, in verse 10. He was able to find joy even in the hardest of times, because it reminded him that in this moment, I have to rely on Jesus, because I can't do this by myself. And I just think that that's especially given the state of our lives. Again, our society in the end really isn't all that different from 2,000 years ago. Man has always been the same. Society has always been the same. It ebbs and flows in terms of values and so forth. But in the end, man hasn't changed. And the types of things that we face hasn't changed. And the importance is that we rely on God, as all the people of faith have always done, going all the way back to the book of Genesis. Even before the law of Moses, the people of faith have relied on God, on Jehovah, and on trusting in his will. I mean, think about Joseph. I mean, what a great example Joseph is of relying on God. Even when times were tough, he relied on God. All right, that's the daily devotional for you today. Keep in mind that obviously for the weekend we won't have any daily devotionals. Next daily devotional will be Monday, Lord willing, at 6:30 Central. So Lord willing, I'll see you all then. Thanks, everybody.